Today, as I open the show, I'm sharing with you a piece I wrote on one of my heavy days. The title is Passage of Time Through the Eyes of Grief. Our senses are dulled. Our realities are covered in haze. Our personal needs go unmet. Our sleeping and eating habits change from one extreme to the other. Our energy levels are unpredictable from day to day. Our ability to respond to everyday life is diminished. Time passes, but our brains are not able to process it. One day turns into another, and suddenly a year, then 2 years, then 3 have passed by. The fog lifts, yet comes and goes. 3 years and 5 months have passed since I heard those words, Teresa, Andrew never made it to the airport. Some days I feel as if I'm living someone else's life, that this couldn't possibly be my life. It's difficult for me to put into words how I feel about the passage of time. I know on the calendar, Andrew died 3 years and 5 months ago, but in my heart, it was yesterday. My body has changed, and I feel like I have no control over it. In sudden death, we lock down in survival mode. Our bodies were made to handle stressful situations on a temporary basis. Because we live there for long periods of time, our bodies and brains will do what it needs to survive. It takes over and makes demands of us. We don't notice the effect this is having on our mind, bodies, and spirits. Then one day we wake to the reality that somehow 3 years and 5 months have passed and our bodies are not the same. Our ability to adjust and adapt to new situations is limited. We observe that others in our life expect us to be okay. We try to conform while thinking in our minds and hearts, if you only knew. Then catching ourselves in the thought and thanking God that they don't know. The adrenaline pumps through our veins and wrecks the balance necessary for the body to function well and provide us with what we need for our everyday life. The battle of balance rages on, to be who we need to be for our families and friends, yet somehow figure out how to make room for ourselves regardless of what others think, expect, or demand. In the midst of managing life under these circumstances, the slightest increase in demands can seem unreasonable. Yet in our minds, we expect of ourselves what we could manage 3 years and 5 months ago, when the person we saw looking back in the mirror is not the same person we see now. How do we rise up from the devastation of a life-altering event? How do we change who we see in the mirror? Today's episode, From Surviving to Living Again, brings clarity to the physiological response to grief. It will assist you as you strive to integrate grief into your everyday life.
Welcome to the Grief Mentor podcast with Teresa Davis. It exists to restore hope, promote healing, and equip grieving souls for life after loss. I will illuminate God's Word through the eyes of grief and provide interviews that speak healing into the mind, body, and spirit of the brokenhearted. I'm so glad you're here.
Today, my guest is Halee Wood. She is a certified life and relationship coach. She and her husband, Ron, own and operate Run the Race Together. Halee serves those rebuilding their lives after loss and trauma. Welcome to the show, Halee.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm so glad to be here. I don't like these topics, but if we're going to be journeying through this, I'm really, really grateful we can do it together. So thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And the title of today's episode is From Surviving to Living Again. So let's get to it, Halee. My first question today is let's talk about grief and how it affects us physically.
Yeah. So I know you're an RN, so you are going to know a lot of the intricacies of these things, but it's just so important to put it out there, because when we start going through the grief process, I think we just start thinking, I've gone crazy. There's something wrong with me, because so many things start to happen. It's like, yeah, I'm sad, but why isn't my brain functioning? And I think the thing I hear most often from people is, for starters, just the fog. I mean, the fog can just be so thick around us. It's like we can't even see the hand in front of our face. Our thoughts get really jumbled up. It's difficult to make decisions. So often early in the grief process, we have a lot of decisions we have to make, right? With, trying to figure out funeral arrangements and things like that. What pictures need to go into, the video. And I mean, there are so many different decisions, but once those decisions are made, it's like everything can come to a screeching halt in our brains. And when you begin to understand what grief does to the body, it makes so much more sense. Rather than just feeling like you've gone crazy, you realize that your body is having a physiological response to the stress that it's experiencing in grief. Something that's interesting to me in a lot of studies about trauma, this has sat with me so much, just even in my own grief journey, is they found that when someone experiences trauma, it often affects our ability to be able to imagine. Often our brains will either just shut down imagining altogether, or the only thing it can do is go back to the traumatic event. Now, there's maybe some argument over whether every loss we experience is traumatic. But I would say, by and large, most losses are on the trauma scale in some ways, and some even further onto the trauma scale. And that literally happens to us. It affects the neurons in the brain. It creates a rut that is very difficult to get out of. And so often when we experience fear, it's because our brain is stuck in that rut. It's hard to imagine any other outcome other than the thing that we experienced pain from, so I don't know about you, but after my loss, I began to think that everybody around me was going to die. I was so concerned. It was our son who passed away. And I remember when our older son got sick for the first time after it happened, and he was laying on the couch and he was running this very high fever. And I thought to myself, I can't make decisions for this young boy, medical decisions, because the last time I made medical decisions for one of my boys, they died. Therefore, this child is going to die. You can see how my brain was in a rut. And that's what happens neurologically within our brain, is our ability to imagine sometimes shuts down. And that's not always the case, but that is often the case. And so it's helpful to understand that rut has been created. It doesn't mean the rut can't go away, but it does mean that the rut has been created. Does that experience sound familiar to you, Teresa?
Absolutely. Yes, because there's like a track. I call it a track in my brain, and it just recycled and recycled and recycled. And I don't think that I would have been able to overcome it or survive it without the therapy that I've had. And that has been instrumental in helping me reimagine different outcomes. So yes, that is great. And you brought up a point about the effect that death is a trauma. Without doubt. Death of a spouse or a child on the scale, I believe it's Holmes and Ray, is 100. It's like the high score you can give. But obviously, your relationship to the person that's passed away significantly affects everything, the physical response, the emotional response, the mental response, because that relationship, our measure of love, is how I like to refer to it, our measure of love really significantly impacts our grief. You can't focus on anything. Like you said in your opening statement, this fog that sits on you, it's like you're in a daze for months. I don't feel like that I realized Andrew wasn't coming home until I was probably in the second year of my grief, just because that first whole probably year, 18 months was just spent in a total fog. I was 56. when Andrew died. So my body was going through a phase of life. It was gearing down. I was going through menopause. And we're going to talk about this a little more about the chronic effects of stress. You mentioned in the very beginning, it's very difficult to figure out what's normal and not normal. Well, I didn't know that my body was in the shape that was in because I had no idea. I was grieving and I had no idea. So I really want to encourage people to please seek medical attention, even when you don't understand what's going on with your body, but you feel so terribly bad.
After our son died, I had actually, and we knew this before he passed, I had developed a tumor that needed to be removed. And it was just, the timing was so difficult that our son passed away, and less than 2 months later, I had to have this 7-hour surgery. And then a couple of months later, my mom died. Okay. So when you have grief, fog is to be expected. And then, I had this hodgepodge of medical issues in the middle of all of it. And so I did actually tell my medical provider, I'm experiencing so much fog. And my medical provider, he reassured me, hey, that's really normal for what you're going through. But as time went on, I kept continuing to blow it off as grief, and only to find out several years later that it wasn't just grief. And so what I will say with exactly what you're saying is sometimes it's even hard for medical providers to discern. And so keep going back. Sometimes it requires kind of that relationship and continuing to check in, and just because somebody says something is fine once, it's still okay to go back and bring it up again because it's very complicated. And, as we're talking about stress and leading in, something that I think is important for people to know is research has shown that the part of the brain that lights up with grief and trauma is actually the same part of the brain that would light up with physical pain. So your brain almost can't even discern between physical and emotional pain. And so we really can't expect our medical providers to be able to just nail it right off the bat. And so be patient with yourself, go back, keep asking questions, keep learning and growing as your body is changing, just like we did in our teenage years as our bodies were changing. We had to keep checking in. And this is the case, whether, you're in the years that your body is changing anyway or not. Like our bodies are going to physically change throughout this process as time goes on after our loss.
And do you think, Halee, the medical field, let's see, how do I put this? I'm in the medical field. So, but do you feel like the medical field is in tune with how to handle that type of pain?
It, I think, varies widely from one medical professional to another. I will say that when we were in the hospital dealing with our son's death, that the medical staff we were with were very well trained. And I'm so grateful for that because I went to many grief groups and sat in the room with other parents who had lost a child whose experiences weren't the same as ours. And so, and even my mother-in-law, she went through a similar experience as we went through, and her experience was absolutely terrifying. So I'm really grateful for the medical professionals I had in my life. And, even with my tumor was on my uterus, and the plan was they were going to take my uterus, but while they were in staffing one day, one of the doctors that were in there heard about the death of our son. And he was like, no, like you can't take this woman's uterus.
Mm-hmm.
he said, we need to give her a chance to heal. Like, we don't want any decisions to be taken from her right now about whether or not she wants to birth another child. Like, that needs to just rest for a while. And this man had experienced a loss of a child. So I think it was emotionally where he was picking up, but he actually interceded for us because we had been asking doctors, please don't do this. I don't want to lose my uterus, and sure enough, he stepped in, and it was a very, it was kind of a risky, meticulous surgery for him to take on, but he did it. And I'm so grateful for that. I would say that probably a couple of handfuls of years ago, I don't know that the medical profession was that in tune to grief and loss. But I have heard many horror stories. I feel incredibly blessed for the way the medical world came along beside us.
Speaking to your point of going back to providers more than once, I feel like that some people they feel you're already very vulnerable when you're grieving. And when you sit before a medical doctor, and you explain, this is what I'm going on, they look back at you and say, well, on paper, there's no abnormal lab work. And there's a tendency, I believe, to overuse pharmaceuticals in that role. Now, I'm a huge advocate of pharmaceuticals. I'm an RN. I have worked for 39 years. But I also do believe that there is wisdom in knowing that the pain that comes, when we talk about pain, we automatically think of something that's temporary, a physical pain that's going to be relieved. But the pain that comes with grief and sorrow is there's no relief. There's no magical anything that's going to take away that pain. And I think our medical profession is geared toward, well, here's a pharmaceutical, this might help. So don't misunderstand me. I've taken antidepressants. I am not talking about that. I'm just talking about over medicating people because they're not able to deal with this pain that's overwhelming them. And I do believe that there's wisdom in your statement that just don't go once. Thankfully, my therapist was very in tune with me at the time, and she recommended a hormone specialist, which literally has changed my journey because she was attentive to things that my medical doctor was not.
Well, bless her. I mean, that is so important, Well, and in talking about pharmaceuticals, Teresa, I think that is a great lead in to talking about other things that grief does to our body, because let's just talk about what stress does to our body, whether it's associated with grief or not. Prolonged stress has lots of implications for our bodies. Like you said, it starts pumping different chemicals into our body that we weren't expecting. So many people end up with high blood pressure. My brain's kind of going blank, but there's increased inflammation, digestive problems, things like that. And many times in our grief process, we may actually need to take medication for some of those things, at least temporarily, to help us until we get into a better, healthier state where our stress levels can come down and we can, learn how to continue to process the grief, walk through the grief, come to a new place in the grief where we're not just surviving, we're trying to live again, those sorts of things. And so sometimes medications, even in that realm, can be really helpful to us. And again, that's just another good reason to keep. And I will say this, there are some medical professionals that are not empathetic to our situation. And to that, I will say, find you a new doctor, because there are good medical professionals out there. And it's just okay. You need to find a doctor that can be with you in that process, because it's not just physical, it's emotional, and they're all interlinked. You can't just take one and put it in this area. And I love that your therapist did the same for you. She looked at you as a whole person. She didn't just look at you at your emotions. She looked at you as a whole person and was able to make good recommendations for you as a whole. And we need to be expecting that of our, of doctors and nurses that are caring for us as well. And if it's not a good fit, just go ahead and move on. It doesn't mean that doctor's bad. It doesn't mean, that they're a bad person, not a great doctor. It just may not be a good fit for you. And that is okay.
And yes, that's excellent advice too, even in regards to a therapist or a counselor. Just because you have one experience doesn't mean that you should stop going, because you got to find that fit. How does sudden death differ as far as how we process our grief versus, say, a chronic illness, a long chronic illness that is followed by death?
Right. So the thing about sudden death is you kind of have two categories of grief. Okay. You have what I'm just going to term normal grief, for lack of a better term. That's grief where emotions ebb and flow, sometimes followed by some times of respite. If there are things that provide comfort, you're able to kind of receive those. With normal grief, over time, the grief doesn't necessarily go away, but over time it will change and it will become, where you are able to live life again. But then you have something that's called complicated grief, which is actually in the counseling world, you can be diagnosed with this from the DSM-5. And there's a lot of technical terms that you can use here, but in this type of grief, it's like your grief actually gets sometimes worse over time. It's sometimes very delayed. Your acute grief basically gets kind of a foothold. Okay. And what I will say about sudden death is it really increases your vulnerability to have this complicated grief. And it just makes us vulnerable to it. I mean, a great example of something that happens to us when we have sudden death is exactly what you were talking about. The longevity of your son's death did not hit you till the second year. It's like you couldn't even come to grips with it. It was so foreign to you that you couldn't come to grips with it in that first year. And that's very typical of sudden grief. I would say that those who have experienced sudden grief also, or sudden loss, also experience the should-have, would-haves, could-haves in a much higher capacity than those who had time to come to grips with the loss. I think about my friend who died in a car accident when we were in high school. It was actually a school trip that they were on. It was a trip that I was supposed to take. This is so horrible for this 14-year-old girl. It was a student council trip. And because I didn't go, an alternate got to go on the trip. Well, guess who the alternate was? It was my best friend. And then she passed away on this, it was it was a car accident. They were in a van and the van flipped and she died in this accident. So what did my 14-year-old heart and mind say? It was supposed to be me. It's all my fault. What if I would have gotten on that van instead of her? And that is just not uncommon. You don't have to be 14 years old for those questions to just embed in your brain and just create that circular cycle of it's my fault. And it's often hard to reconcile those sorts of things.
What hinders people the most from integrating grief into their everyday life? And I do want to preface it with this. I was offended by people who referred to grief as something you got over. I'm
laughing because I'm like, it just kind of like crawls all over us, doesn't it?
Yes. So it's a virus that you're going to recover from. And I've used the word recover too, but as you process your grief, and that's huge. I have a saying that says, if you don't manage your grief, it will manage you. As you process your grief, we get to a place to where we can integrate. We pull our loved one with us into the future, because so often we feel like, well, if I stop grieving, then everybody's going to forget the one that I loved. But in a healthy grieving situation, you can learn to integrate your grief and take them forward with you to be able to live again. So in your experience, what have you seen that hinders people from being able to integrate that?
The number one thing I see, and I will tell you that I'm a Christian. I love Jesus. I love the church. But I would say by and large, especially among Christians, I believe that we somehow feel like grief is counter to a walk of faith. And so what I see is probably the largest hindrance to many of the people I walk alongside is that we don't honor our grief. And when I think, I'm going to talk about something biblically real quick. I think about the Apostle Paul in the Bible. He just went from one hard circumstance to another. And one of the things that he said over and over and over is he says, don't be ashamed of my testimony. And so he's not saying like, I'm fine, everybody, I'm fine. He's like, dude, I am carrying around these chains. This is some really rough stuff, but like God's glory is still going to prevail. And I always want to tell people, if we are not honest about the depth of the valley that we're in, then it really doesn't show how great God is to be able to pull us back up out of that valley. We have to be able to be honest to ourselves, to those around us, about the pain we're going through. And that does, in fact, truly honor God, because the only reason we grieve so much is because we had the opportunity to love so much. And by me and my Christian faith, I believe that I gained that capacity because of Christ. And so to grieve this much actually brings honor and glory to the fact that he gave me a capacity to love so deeply. And so I think that by and large, and maybe it's the American in us also, I don't know. I think sometimes we associate grief with weakness, especially if it goes on past some period of time that we deem fine to grieve. You know, we feel like we should be able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and just trudge right along, when in fact, you know, we don't have to leave every aspect of grief behind. There's aspects of grief that are honorable and can maybe even go with us, because we learn so much and we do grow in the midst of our grief. You know, it's not something we have to separate ourselves from. There are beautiful aspects of it that can come forward with us. And so I think an inability to honor our grief is one of the biggest factors to not being able to continue stepping forward.
In the opening statement, I mentioned how what is going on in our body is unseen. If one of us would have a terrible accident and we would break several limbs, or we would have a major surgery, people can see that. And so they're compassionate and willing to tolerate or support you for the length of time because they can see that. But when we are wounded on the inside by life, whether it's loss, divorce, not being able to have biological children, when we're wounded on the inside, that's not visible by people. So first of all, there's that. And then there's the chronic stress. The effect that chronic stress has on you. And I read this article. I wanted to share something with you that it was in Health and Science. And it said chronic stress can impact how the brain functions, as long-term exposure to the stress hormones actually is linked to killing brain cells. And the region of the brain that's responsible for grief, which we could get technical, but it's basically the cortex, but it also regulates our appetite. It regulates our sleep. People are watching on the outside, and I'll be vulnerable here. I couldn't sleep, and I was trying to comfort myself. So I would get up at night and walk the floors and cry and eat. So, and then people look at us like, wow, she gained quite a bit of weight. But they have no idea the chemical surge of everything. And cortisol is necessary for life. Too much of it can be very detrimental on our brains and our organs. We were created for fight or flight. That's what cortisol does. Our body has a release of catecholamines whenever we're faced with a threat, because we need that surge of energy to be able to respond. But we were not created for that to stay in our systems for 2 years. And so the long-term effect of that is so debilitating on the inside. And that's what people don't see. So they're looking at us and they're judging us and they're saying, well, it's been 2 years, that kind of thing for people. And not everybody does that. And maybe they think it and they don't say it. I don't know. But I do think it's so important to point out that you can't see all of these things that's happening inside of you. And I believe that hinders us from being able to integrate our grief. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And one thing that I think is helpful about having conversations like this is because if somebody can identify, oh, I'm not eating, or I am eating, or I'm not sleeping, or I'm sleeping all the time, just having these conversations about that our body is physically responding to this, we can thank God for the fact that our bodies are doing that. That is not a malfunction of our bodies. Like you said, we were created for fight or flight. So instead of saying like, stupid body, why are you doing this to me? We can say, oh, it's like saying alarm, alarm, alarm. you need care. And that it's telling us something. It was designed to do that for a reason. It is our alarm system for us to help us understand that we need to be able to, whatever that next step is. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to shoot us into anything because there's some people that swing one direction or another in their response to some of those chemicals coming into our systems. But it's an alarm system. And so being able to, again, kind of going along even with what I was saying earlier, is just like honoring that, going, oh man, I'm so glad that I understand that now, because I can see that my body is really sending off this alarm, and there's other levels of care that could be really beneficial to me in this journey.
What would you say to someone that's experiencing, without the obvious, we know if someone is experiencing complicated grief, they really need to be working with a therapist. What are some steps, some helpful, healthy steps that we could take in the direction of being able to integrate our grief into our everyday life?
Sometimes it's almost like we have to take some time to recover from the grief, because grief can be so exhausting. And so I have a couple of things here. Now, the things that I'm going to share, I want to just stop and point out that we are not shooting on anyone with these ideas that we're sharing. These are just tools and ideas for maybe a next step for someone. Okay, so I'm going to throw 5 ideas out there, but I don't want anybody to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm failing if I haven't gone and done all of these things, So the first thing I would say is take a look, just take a moment to try to identify what became necessary for survival. The adaptive behaviors that became necessary for survival. So for you talked about pacing the floor, maybe even grabbing a bite to eat in the midst of that. There were things that you did to help get you through that intense trauma and intense times of grief. And just identify all of those things. And I'm going to tell you that as you begin to list them, you're going to realize they're not all bad. There were some things that came about in your mode of survival that you're going to think to yourself, I may actually want to take that forward with me. And so that's what you can do. You can make a list of things that you didn't do before that became a part of your life as you were in survival mode. And then you're going to really start putting them into 2 categories. Is this something I want to take forward with me? Or is this something that needs to be adapted or potentially filtered out altogether? Now, when I say adapted, these are things that maybe became like compulsory, so I think about one of the changes with me was I felt like I needed to make sure I had a good goodbye with the people that I love. Like if we were parting ways, going to school or going to work or whatever, it was like always in the back of my mind, I could think to myself, this may be the last time I talk to this person. Or if I was talking to somebody on the phone, I'm like, okay, I kind of need to remember what we're talking about here, because what if this is our last conversation? I don't want to forget what our last conversation was, right? That's compulsory. But there is an aspect of that I did want to take forward with me. And the aspect I wanted to take forward with me is just really appreciating the relationships that I do have and holding those tightly. And when somebody does leave my presence, I think it is pretty good that they know that I love them, and for me to kind of take these mental pictures and be like, wow, what a gift, that I have this relationship in my life, and just to kind of take that mental snapshot. So one is that they might look very much the same on the outside, but one is a little more compulsory, meaning if I don't do that, I might panic and kind of freak out. So it's like, okay, that may need to go forward with me in appreciating my relationships, but let me get some help to see how I can relieve some of the tension and trauma response that has come along with that. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So that is a very valuable tool. Now, the nice thing about getting this list together is you don't have to take care of it all at once. You kind of just have it out there in front of you. And this is a great opportunity to go seek out a coach like myself, get together with a friend and even say, hey, like I've identified this, walk along with me in this. This is not a list to be dealing with alone. And so that is a really good opportunity to invite community back into your life. And if it is something that is compulsory, good. I'm glad you've identified that. Maybe you did go to counseling early in your grief recovery. This might be a great time to go back. And yes, grief is going to be a topic of conversation, but maybe your goal is really more about what is, like how can you get your brain out of that rut that has created this compulsory behavior. So it's a great opportunity to invite community back into your process. Do you have any thoughts on that as I shared that?
Well, I was processing while you were talking because Tony and I and my daughter-in-law, we all three went to the same therapist in the beginning because he was this gracious, most kindest hearted person I've ever met. And he was recommended to us and he did not charge us. But we didn't go together. We went separately, but he had the advantage of hearing all of our stories. It was a very unique situation, but my counseling needs then were way different. So talk therapy worked for me a while. And then I had a lot of trauma involved in the way Andrew died. So I had to seek some more intensive therapy. So I really hated moving on from him because God just placed him in our lives for such a time as this. He was so precious to me. Then I moved on to another counselor that helped me with dealing with the trauma. We worked together for 18 months. And then I felt like, you know what? I think I'm okay. You feel very vulnerable. It's like, can I do this? Can I really function? Because, I would collect things all week that, we would work on. So then I had this little time that I wasn't in counseling, but then new things, integrating life. That's what we're talking about, integrating grief into your everyday life. Then I developed new needs for which I see a different counselor now because the counselor that I had before, I don't need that intensive trauma treatment, but I need help with this. So kind of like our grief evolves and then you take a few steps. And I'll say this, goodness gracious, don't be so hard on yourself. We go through this horrible experience of death, and then we feel like a year later or 2 years later, we feel like, well, what's wrong with me? We're so hard on ourselves that it was like, my gosh, our whole world has changed. So be cognizant. I would add, just be cognizant of the fact that your needs are going to change throughout your grief journey. Be cognizant of the fact that just because, you get through a rough patch, you don't need counseling anymore. I believe God has provided these wonderful people with all these wonderful skills that we need. And I know money is an issue for a lot of people. That's why I really, really encourage Griefshare. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes,
ministry.
I've been through Griefshare. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Oh, and you just griefshare.org, you plug in your zip code. You can spend 13 weeks in a classroom setting where there's video driven and breakout sessions. I did it twice. I think my daughter-in-law did it 5 times. I'm not kidding. I think she did it 5 times because the first time you go through it, you're in a different place than the second time we went through it. I saw things, heard things that I didn't hear and see the first time. So I do think it's not a one and done. Would you agree, Halee?
I totally agree. And, kind of going into honoring your grief. So sometimes the cycle that Satan would put into our mind is, what's wrong with you? Why haven't you gotten this yet? But I see it as a gift from God because there's like this big onion, that is like all of our grief, right? And it's almost like God says, you know what? If I were to just expose you to the whole thing, it would just, it would be overwhelming. So I'm just going to take this layer back. Okay, let's deal with that. That's what you can handle. That's how I'm going to equip you. We're going to walk through that. Okay, next layer. And so, we can look at it actually as a gift, not what is wrong with me that I haven't gotten this yet. It's just like, oh, it's a new layer. Thank God he didn't give me this layer, while I was dealing with that other layer, because that would be so much to deal with at once. It's a gift that those layers are spread out for us so that we can do it. And you can look at the layers in another way too. You know, sometimes our layers can block us from what's behind, you know, that door. And so once one door has been opened and you've experienced healing, it really just gives you that opportunity to go deeper, to become stronger. And you're really cleaning out this wound that has the potential to get infected if you don't just keep kind of cleaning it out. And it really is an opportunity for us to learn so much about ourselves and to take our grief journey one step at a time, instead of just having it all fall on us at once.
I love the analogy of the wound. That's a great analogy because it is a wound.
That first one is a big one because, I mean, I will say almost all of us, I hate to use, you know, all, never, all that kind of stuff, but almost all of us create habits in our grief that we probably don't want to take into our future with us. I wanted to share one thing that I did take into my future with me too, was my connection with God. It became something new in my grief, and I was happy to carry that forward. Okay. So we identified, you know, things that had become necessary for survival, what needs to go with us and what needs to, you know, stay behind. The second one is to begin taking steps toward healing wounded relationships. I don't know what your grief journey was like for you, but there were some people that didn't show up that I thought should show up. There were some people that, like, for whatever reason, I just couldn't be around them because it was really hard, or, you know, like, grief is just weird. And people that you loved before sometimes now rub you the wrong way. People say things, they don't know what they're doing. I think it's just a part of the secondary loss of our grief journey is wounded relationships. So just to kind of ask God to help you begin to understand, like, who is it that I need to forgive or even potentially make amends with? If people are interested in going in that in detail, I actually do something that I call a LEAP journal to help people kind of begin to process, you know, what relationships were injured, understanding like what was so injuring about that, and what do I need to do? And sometimes it doesn't mean reconciliation, because sometimes people truly are hurtful, and they mean to hurt. You know, they just kind of get rid of you in the midst of your grief. But most of the time, that's not the case in the grief journey. People don't know how to respond to grief. And so even if you don't reconcile with someone, that process of forgiveness and amends can be such a powerful part of our journey. And so just saying to yourself, maybe I should consider that. And sometimes that forgiveness and amends is in our relationship with God, and especially with ourselves. I mean, I was so hard on myself. I got so angry at myself because I was not the person I was before. You know, I used to be the sharp decision maker. You know, I worked in an industry that required me 24/7. And all of a sudden, like, I just wasn't that person anymore. And I was so angry at myself for not being that person anymore. And so, so the forgiveness and amends process. The third thing I would say is take a step towards serving others, yet still allow yourself to be served. And that is so important. And so with you chose to serve in a way that was specifically connected to your grief. Not everybody needs to do that, but I would encourage someone. I think about a friend of mine in our neighborhood. She became a very young widow. And about a year and a half after the loss of her husband, there was another woman in the neighborhood whose husband passed away. And I noticed that Jackie was just going and taking food over every once in a while. And now she goes to lunch with that woman every Thursday, you know? And so, I mean, it serves her because she has a source of connection, right? But it also came out of a heart of service. And this is important because it is so hard to start practicing thinking about other people again, because our minds are so consumed with what has happened. So learning to serve but continuing to be served because our hearts still need to be served as well. The fourth thing I'll say, and this is going to hurt, I think, when I say this for a lot of people, is plan to dream again. I'm not telling you that you have to go out and start dreaming big right away, but just plan to dream again. Start to ask yourself, like, would you be willing to dream again? What will it take for you to be able to dream again? Because the thing is, like, our loss would not be so impactful if it wasn't part of a dream. You dreamed of growing old with your son, coming to your house and, watching him be a dad, right? I mean, there were so many dreams that are attached with our children, with our spouses, and so I remember having this conversation with God, because he told me one time, like, it's time for you to dream again. And I'm like, oh, no, because if I dream, that makes me vulnerable for this kind of pain. I'm not ready for that, And so that is true. Dreaming is a very, very vulnerable step. So I'm not telling you to go dream, but begin to ask yourself, would you be willing to take that step? And then with a coach or a counselor or a friend, maybe ask them, if you are a person of faith, ask them to be praying with you to help you to be able to dream again. And the thing about dreaming again, it doesn't mean that you have to create all new dreams apart from the person that you had before. But it's like, is there something new to discover with that dream? Or is there something I lost sight of that I want to bring into this new phase of life with me? There's a lot of things that you can do in that dreaming phase. And the last thing I'll say is just to continue to make space for complicated grief. And that is part of the step of learning to live life again, rather than just being in survival mode, is with every season, new season of life, we're going to experience, new types of grief. Like our son would have been 10 this past year. And that 10th birthday just felt, it was like, it's two numbers. It's not one number. And like the last time I held him, he was an infant. Like 10-year-olds don't like to be held in that way. And, and so it was very difficult to wrap my mind around it. And so I hit like this milestone that was very difficult for, again, my body and my mind to comprehend. And it kind of threw me into a cycle. And so we need to make space for that complicated grief. I had a sweet neighbor who had been married to her husband for over 60 years when he passed away. And of course, she went through really deep grieving. And a little over a year after he passed away, she was outside messing with her flowers and things like that. And so we went to the fence to say hello. And we were just complimenting him. We love your flowers so much, Hazel. We're so glad that, like even now that Iverson is gone, that you still come out here and plant them. And tears began to roll down her face. And she said, I haven't seen in color since Iverson passed. And the thing was, like, Hazel was doing well in her grief. She was not in survival mode still at that point, but that was a piece of her grief that had continued to move forward with her, and she had no control over. It was a way that her body was continuing to respond to the loss of her husband of over 60 years. Like, it totally makes sense to me, but we can get so frustrated at ourselves that this complicated grief still kind of follows us around, will continue to rear its head. But again, it's because our love for these people is so incredibly deep that it is, it's going to have some impacts on us for a very long time to come. And so it's an opportunity for us to honor the loss and honor our grief in the process. So,
Halee, are those steps going to be in that link that you shared with me?
I can make that part of it. I'll put that. I've got one page on there, and I'll just make this on the second page. I can certainly do that.
They're really good. And the points that you made, I was just absorbed in every single one of them, because every single one of them is a part of my life. So I know that if that's true for me, it's going to be true for my listeners.
Thank you, Teresa.
We're coming to the end of our time together, but where does faith come in? How do you see that affect people's grief journeys?
I'll speak for myself personally real quick. There's a verse, and I wrote it down. I have it here in front of me because it's Psalm 27:13. It just said, I would have despaired unless I had believed I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And I remember thinking to myself, heaven had just kept feeling so far away. It's like, do I just white knuckle it till I get to heaven? And when I read this verse, I thought, is there life in the land of the living? Can I discover that? Is this verse true? And so, yeah, faith played a huge role for me. And here's what I've seen, and here's what research tells us. Research tells us that faith definitely has an impact on our grief journey, but it doesn't impact whether or not we can have a successful grief process. And what I mean by that is what they've seen in most studies is that those who have either a strong faith or kind of even a surface level faith will progressively go through grief, journey through grief a little bit faster than those apart from any kind of faith. Okay. And that is not specific to Christianity. That's lots of different types of faith. Okay. So that's what statistics tell us in a lot of different studies. And I see that in with the people that I walk alongside too. I think that faith, by and large, produces a hope in our journey that sometimes people who don't have faith struggle with. I will tell you the aspects of faith that I think can really be valuable to us in our journey, especially from the Christian perspective. We are told that when we believe in Jesus, we are given the power of the Holy Spirit. And so if that is true, I believe that there is a power that is living in me that is way more powerful than myself. So while I don't think I can get up another day, I don't think, I can, go and be with people, like that power that's living within me can. So, it is a belief for me that there is something greater living in me than is possible just by myself. The other aspect is the idea that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That's in Matthew 5. Those were words of Jesus. And I experienced that, and so that's kind of where this idea to me, I'm like, man, like grief is hard, but it's not a curse necessarily, because it is a process that we can go through to honor the love, like we've talked about before, that has been given to us. Look, the loss part is terrible, but what can happen in the grief journey does not necessarily have to be. And when I hear the word, they will be comforted, I have come to believe that word comforted is just a really, really inadequate word for what Jesus can do in our lives in the midst of that deep grief. Because I believe we're so broken and so vulnerable at that point that we can hear him and experience him in ways that we couldn't if we weren't that broken. So I tell God all the time, I'm still not thankful that I lost my son. I'm not like, oh man, I'm so glad I lost him, so now I have this, but I'm like, I'm not going to say that. But what I will say is, if I lost my son, I'm so grateful for the comfort that I received, because it's more than I can put words to or comprehend. So the Holy Spirit, the comfort of Jesus, but there's also three aspects to pretty much all types of faith, and especially in the Christian faith. And that is idea of community, the idea of purpose, like we have a purpose in this life, not just for us. So it's like we have a purpose to keep on living, but we also see purpose in the life of the one that we lost. So we have community, purpose, and the last piece is that this idea of the afterlife. It gives us hope to hold on to. Like I said before, sometimes heaven feels really, really far away, but there is still something that is very powerful to me to believe that I get to see my son, my mom, my dad, my friend, all of those things again. But that being said, Teresa, statistics show that, faith can be incredibly powerful in our journey, but it can also be a horrible beating stick that we can use on ourselves, that other people can use against us. Like the saying, God is good all the time, God is good, like I have cringed so much when I hear that, because like people use that phrase with me in my grief process. It'd be like, hey, how you doing? And then if you were kind of like, man, this is really hard, they're like, yeah, but God is good all the time, God is good. And I'm like, I do believe that, but like,
it sure don't feel that way right now. That's what I would think in my head.
What does that even mean right now? And so I think what happens is sometimes it puts a lot of, I always just say, don't should on yourself. Don't should on yourself, because with some of those like flippant phrases and things like that, I think it puts just a lot of weight on us that we're not meant to carry. There's a lot of wrestling of faith that God gives us lots of room to do during our grief process. I look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that alone gives me so much freedom to live out my grief and my pain and my suffering. Because I say, Jesus knew exactly how long he was going to suffer. He knew it was coming, and he knew what the end result was going to be. Yet he still sat in that garden and sweat blood because his grief was so intense. We don't have all perspective. We have no idea how long the pain is going to last. And we're not quite sure of the outcome except for heaven. Right. And so like if Jesus, who was one with the Father, had freedom to like live out his grief and express it to God and tell him like, I would rather not do this, then why don't I have the same freedom?
Absolutely. And yes, I totally agree that there is a thought out there that all you need is Jesus. But sometimes when you're grieving, yes, you need Jesus, but you need people with skin on, and you need help. Because God knows we're human. He makes us strong in our weakness, and he knows that. So that's a comfort. But two things that I want to point out about faith. Number one, my faith has kept me from losing my mind. I am convinced that Andrew, he doesn't have a physical body anymore, but he's not dead. Okay. He lives on. Yeah. That is a hope that I have. But if you're listening today, you're just quite not sure about all that stuff, this is what I invite you to do. If you're exploring your spirituality, I invite you to do exactly what Halee said. I invite you to ask God the questions, and ask him the hard questions, and be honest. Tell him how you feel. That's exactly what I did. If you go back and listen to some of my podcasts, my first ones that I did, I felt betrayed. I blamed God for the whole thing. I questioned my entire faith. And it was through that questioning period, and because of my seeking and never stopping that seeking, he revealed himself to me in a way that would have never happened had I not sought him. So this is what I encourage you to do. If you're listening and you're a person of faith, to God be the glory. But if you're listening and you're hanging on the edge because you don't know where your loved one is, and you're not sure about this whole faith thing, and you don't even know how you're going to be able to face tomorrow, will you just tell Jesus about it? Just tell him about it. Just be honest, because he cares and he's listening, and he knows that we are human. And just the points that Halee just pointed out about Christ and the suffering, even though he had all the answers, he still suffered. So, we don't have all the answers and we suffer, but we can trust the one who does. And I know that's kind of like a cliche, and so I don't say it very often, but, there is an element of faith in believing in a spiritual world. I mean, there's just no doubt about it, right? We can't see it. The scripture tells that if you believe the word of God, that there's a veil that separates us, the physical from the supernatural right now. If you read in the Old Testament, you'll see in times where God allowed people to see past that veil. I say in my devotion book, it's a good thing I can't see it, because I'd be trying to figure out a way to climb through it to get to my boy. But if you're in that space where you're just not sure about, just seek. The Bible says when you knock on the door, it'll be open. When you seek me with a heart like that, you'll find me. So Halee, is there anything else you want to add before we close out our time together today?
That is what I took forward with me for my grief. the what Jesus brought to the table for me during my grief journey was just so much more than I could put words to. And I mean, it's really what even brought me to go and seek certifications for coaching and things like that, because it's just like, man, it's just something that pours out of me now that I don't know that I had. Gosh, I love Jesus even before I went in, but I just didn't get it. And Teresa, one of the things that he said to me the morning that our son died, I was being very bossy and demanding of him. I said, I'm about to get the worst news of my life. So I don't know how you're going to do this, but you need to prepare me for this. It's your job. That's what you have to do. And very few times do I feel like I've heard God just like super loud and clear. But he said to me, do you think this is a surprise to me? I've been preparing you for a long time. And that was hard for me to cope with and to understand. But as I looked back, even through old journals and things like that, I saw things in my old journals that I couldn't even comprehend, because I was like, oh my gosh, there were pieces where he had been preparing me and he had been strengthening me and he had been, carrying me, and he carried me. My deepest grief lasted for about 3.5 years. I know everybody's is different. Some people's may be longer. Some people might be like, that was too long, but that's just what it was for me. And when it was time for me to start living life again, I felt like I had to find ways to incorporate that relationship I'd gained with Jesus, even apart from tragedy and trauma. It was like, how do I keep this? Because I can't breathe apart from him any longer. And I think that had always been true. I just finally knew it. And he just instilled something in me that I could not have survived. That is my opinion. That is my experience. I just don't think I could have survived.
I echo your experience and your opinion. And I have something to say about something you just said, whether 3.5 years was too long. Guess what? It's your grief, Halee. Nobody gets to judge your grief. And I tell people that all the time. It's your grief. Nobody lives inside of your head. They don't live inside of your body. No one gets to judge your grief. It's not fair. So, and it's in our society, I feel like that we do not grieve well. As Americans, we don't grieve well. But I want to leave everyone with this. Remember, your grief is a testimony to the one you love. And our loved one is always going to be an integral part of our story. And moving forward is not something that's bad, because you're moving forward with them. You're taking them with you. So there's nothing to feel guilty about, because so often when we start to make progress in integrating our grief, we have these huge overwhelms of feeling guilty because, well, how can we possibly get to a place to where we can function because this person's not here? But I promise you, your love is an indicator of the relationship you have with that person, and you're taking that love with you. Nobody's going to take that love away from you. That love between the person that you lost is always going to be that connection with you. So there's nothing to feel guilty about that. And Halee, I want to thank you. Tell us how the listeners can connect and find you.
So runtherace.together.com is one of the easiest things that you can do. On there, you can find my email address. If you wanted to walk, if you would allow me to walk with you on your journey, or even want to connect once, I always do one free session with people. And you can find that on the website too. Even if it's just to connect and talk about what we shared here today, you're welcome to use a free session. And that way I would love to do that. Or you can email me at Halee@runtherace.together.com. And of course, all the social media stuff at Run the Race Together, those sorts of things. And don't forget, there's going to be the link that Teresa is going to provide you guys that'll have these steps that we talked about today. And there's also going to be 8 tips that I'm giving you for learning to live again 15 minutes at a time. And so hopefully that will be of benefit to you in your journey to living again.
Thank you again, Halee. I'm so excited that we had this time together. And guys, that is all I have for you this time. So until next time.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Grief Mentors podcast with Teresa Davis. Subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to share this episode with someone in your sphere of influence that needs it today.